All right, we're going to start to take a look at some fractions and a couple of basic things about them, and also a few different ways that we can represent fractions. Basic things that we need to know about is a fraction is a small part or item forming a piece of a whole. The numerator of a fraction is the top part of the fraction, representing, this is important here, it represents the number of parts you may have. So the important part being the number of parts. The denominator of the fraction is the bottom part, the bottom number, representing the total number of parts. So here's an example. In this fraction, we have 3 parts out of a total of 4. So the fraction is 3/4. Here are a couple of different fractions to look at. This is a whole fraction. All of our parts are shaded. This is 1/4 of a fraction, 1/2 of a fraction, and 1/3 of a fraction. One thing you might want to notice is that with each of these, the parts are all the same size within that fraction. Each fourth is the same size. Each third is the same size as the other thirds. Same thing here, each half is the same size. A quick rule for fractions is that whenever we make fractions or look at fractions, all parts of the figure must be the same size. For example, this figure does represent the fraction 1/2 because the parts are equal in size. My shaded half is the same size as my unshaded half, so that is a fraction. Here, even though I split a line across the middle of it, this does not represent 1/2 because the parts are not equal in size. The top half of my shape is much larger than the bottom, so this is not a fraction. So for example, if you're taking a look at this, trying to decide if they are or are not a fraction, you need to remember that all the parts must be equal in size. So I think that this is a fraction because those two halves are equal. This is a fraction, and this is a fraction. But I think that this is not a fraction because those parts are not equal. This is not a fraction, and this is not a fraction. Maybe you can pause the video here for a second to decide out of what shapes are left, which are fractions and which are not. Here are a couple of tips for drawing fractions. One thing for me personally is that whenever I draw fractions, I always like to draw them in squares or rectangles. This is just going to be the easiest way to maintain equal sizes in your shapes. So for example, if I'm trying to divide this into fifths, I can just add lines, and it might not be perfect, but I pretty much have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different parts. Now let's say I try to do a circle into fifths. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's a little bit tougher. Same thing here. If I have something and I'm trying to divide it into thirds, you got to be careful about the way you do it. I'm going to keep my lines pretty much only going up and down or maybe horizontally. What you don't want to do is something like this, because even though this works for a circle, it's not going to work for a square, because this section here is now much larger than this section here. So this is not a fraction. And this is much harder to maintain equal sizes. I would stick with things like this if I wanted to say that's 2/5, and this to say that is 1/3. So I'm going to stick with rectangles and squares and draw pretty much only vertical or sometimes horizontal lines. Okay, something else to look at is that these fractions can come in many different forms or representations. So for example, this I can see 1 is shaded out of 4 parts total, so I think this is 1/4. It can be written in numbers as 1/4. It can also be written in words as 1/4. Looking at this one, I can see that half of it is shaded, so I'll use the number representation of 1/2 and the word representation of 1/2. Maybe you can pause the video here to decide how to label these other 3 fractions. Okay, a couple more things for us to remember is that what we want to be able to do is to identify fractions and represent fractions. Identify A fraction means that given a situation or a picture or a story, we can tell them what the fraction is. So if I'm looking here, what fraction of the cans are Mountain Dew? This is going to be my numerator. I'm looking for the cans of Mountain Dew, and I can see there's 2 cans. So my numerator is going to be 2, and my denominator is going to be the number of cans total, which I counted as 6. So I'm going to identify this as 2/6 of the cans are Mountain Dew. Another thing I want to be able to do is to represent fractions. This says, draw a picture to show a cake where 1/4 has been eaten. This time they're giving me the fraction, and I need to represent it. So I'm going to draw, and I'm going to have 4 parts because my denominator is 4. And I'm going to think if 1/4 has been eaten, let's say I pretend this one has been eaten, then the other 3 parts still remain. So this fraction, 3/4, represents a cake where 1/4 has been eaten. One last thing to think about is here. What are the odds that someone chooses a can of Coke? So let's say they reach into a cooler. These are the only cans that are in there. I want to know what are the odds that they choose a can of Coke. I'm going to give them a fraction, a number fraction. I'm going to say, well, there are 4 cans of Coke. So I'm going to say they have a 4 out of 6 chance of pulling a Coke out of the cooler. Then I'm going to use a word to describe the situation, to describe how likely it is. I'm going to use likely, unlikely, certain, or impossible to describe it. So I would say 4 out of 6, that seems like more than half. I'm going to say they have a likely chance of pulling a Coke out of that cooler. Let's look at another example. Here, the question is, what fraction would show the number of footballs? So I'm just going to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 5 footballs, and if I'm pretending this is a bin at recess with a bunch of different equipment inside, there were 5 footballs out of, let's see, there's 4 soccer balls plus 5 out of 9 total. So 5/9 of the items in that bin are footballs. That's what I identified. Now to represent another one, it says cut the circle into 1/8 and shade half of them. What fraction did you shade? So now I have halves, I have 4ths, and now I have 1/8. And if I shade half of them, 1, 2, 3, 4, the fraction I shaded was 4/8 or 1/2. So that's representing a fraction. And one more to look at. What are the odds that someone chooses a basketball? So here I have 5 footballs, 4 soccer balls. I don't see any basketballs, so I'm going to say they have a 0 out of 9 chance of choosing a basketball. And the odds that they choose a basketball, well, that's going to be impossible because there are none to choose from. Let's look at another one. I need to identify what fraction of the birds are black. So I'm going to count. There's 3 black birds out of total, out of 9. 3/9 of the birds are black. I'll represent a fraction here. There are 9 shapes. 6/9 are circles and the rest are squares. Well, I'll go ahead and draw 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 circles, and the rest are squares. So if I'm thinking there's 6 that are circles, 9 total, so that must mean 3 more are squares. So here I've given the fraction 6/9 circles, 3/9 squares. Last thing to look at, if someone walks into a pet store and this is their selection, the question is, what are the odds that someone chooses a bird? Well, it looks like they don't have any other animals, so the odds are 9 out of 9, and it's certain that they'll choose a bird. Those are just a couple of things for you to remember and think about as we're moving into fractions. We're going to do a little bit more coming up next, but for now, just some things for you to think about and remember as we get started.